going to very briefly introduce Gregg Brown of Microsoft, he has an official title here, which is on the board, Senior Director Strategy for CELA Corporate Standards Group. CELA is basically their legal in-house shop. But in reality, what Gregg is, he's like Microsoft's standards guy.
I don't know
who drives the development of all of the standards work internally, and knows a lot about this subject.
We'll moderate that. First of all, let me thank people for coming back from the break. Some of you left your stuff, which was very encouraging, but it's always a bit dodgy. I am going to talk a little bit about standards, which to me are a deep passion, but not to everyone sometimes. So what I'd like to do is speak for about a half an hour, and then because of my role at Microsoft, I do get some insight into our sort of operations and compliance and things like that, and we'll leave some time open for questions, not only prompted by what I'm going to say, but other questions about how we do things in operations. So I'll hold the questions till then, but I am open to sort of visual signals, as subtle as having your forehead hit the table or something like that. I'll try and change and what I'm doing as I go along. So our group, there are a lot of people who do standards inside Microsoft. We connect to a ton of other products. We have devices that have USB ports and things like that. We do a lot of standards work. Our group focuses on international standards, standards that are basically voted on by nations, created by technical experts and then voted on by nations. And we really lately been focusing on standards that deal with security and privacy and the cloud. So there is some narrowing of my scope, but our team works on the submissions into the international standards effort. What do we draft to suggest would be a good idea? And as you may know, the standards process, the international level is very slow. It's a couple of 3-4 years for a standard. And some of that is of very high value because they get vetted very deeply and they get voted on by the experts, but then they get voted on by the national standards bodies of all the nations. And so they carry with them some benefits. They're like, for example, it's a per se not a non-tariff barrier to trade, to quote an international standard. So if you have an RFQ and you say you have to support ISO 27001 in the RFQ, it's not considered a barrier to trade around the world, right? You're allowed to do that kind of things, but that means they're looked at very carefully. It takes a long time to do it. So I'll be focusing mostly on international standards. And we'll talk about these kinds of topics. What's the role of standards? How does it work with privacy? I want to introduce you to some standards that are bubbling up for you to think about and maybe participate in. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's coming up next. Okay, so what are the roles for standards, and particularly international standards? And we tend to focus on them in two separate ways. One of which is as the basis of certification, basis of third-party audits. Okay? And the second one is a way to increase transparency, to allow people to be using the same terminology, the same structure of thought, the same taxonomies in order to be able to communicate. Both of those, I hope to demonstrate, are critical for the upcoming complexity of conversations we're going to have about privacy. Right? We'll start with certification for a little bit. There's in international standards and ISO level standards, there's a chain between, there's actually 3 or 4 parts to a certificate. There is a standard. Upon the standard, somebody makes a scheme, an audit scheme, and then there's an actual audit process, and then they issue a certificate. And for an international standard, all of those elements are regulated by the national bodies. So if you have the British Standards Institute come out and do an audit, they're an accredited auditor by the British government. And you will notice that on some of those certificates, there will be the Queen's mark on it, just like an Altoid or something else, but that comes from the Queen. So these have a certain provenance of what you're allowed to do and not do in those certificates. But there are all those elements. You can take a standard and create another scheme against it. CSA does this, takes 27001, expands the scope, and creates another scheme of auditing that reuses some of 27001, does some new things with it as well. So all of those elements are in place. But the key part of that is you can do a third-party audit. The second one, and there are two parts to that. In the 27001 world, there's a standard that says, here's how you should do things. Here's how you should think about risk. Here's how you should build a process that will allow you to be risk-enabled. And then we mentioned 27018, which is a specific set of controls that said, for cloud service providers acting as processors, we want you to tell us why you're not doing these controls, right? So put in your statement of applicability why you're doing or not doing, so you can have narrower cases that you can audit against. Transparency, we want to be using the same language, the same semantics, the same meanings in order to communicate some difficult concepts, and I'll talk about those standards in a little bit. So one thing we talked about, somebody asked a great question about boundaries and scopes, and when you go to a cloud service provider, it's worthwhile for the kind of practitioners that are sitting in front of me in the audience to go look at the actual services that you're going to buy and see which actual certificates are against those scope of services. I've pictured here our broadest services with our strongest set of certificates on it. But if you, for example, the extreme case, take a beta product, it may be out of scope. We just bought LinkedIn. LinkedIn services, I'm sure they have some stuff, but I'm not sure it's 27001 certified to our level yet. So you will see from Microsoft, these services, and this is the highest level, these services have these certificates about it, and that's worth looking at. Right? That means they've been certified and they've gone through things. Now, how do we do all of those as we, for once, this was my first presentation without the set of logos. But how do we do all of those certificates? Well, Microsoft participates in, beginning in the external process. We work with the definition of standards. We have, I think, a very good communication with NIST about what should happen in FedRAMP. They listen, and they do whatever they want to do, but they do listen. So we work on standards to try and condition them, to make them realistic to what we think is happening in cloud. And then internally, we do a business process that says which customers want which certifications, how much market will it open up, who cares about it, and determine on a set of certificates. And then, as Doug mentioned, we go look to see what controls do we already have in place that we can do a control equivalency mapping to, and what new controls come in place. And that applies to standards, of course, applies to everything else. So GDPR, we are in active daily conversations right now, pouring through GDPR saying, okay, are there new obligations in there that we are not covering in this service that we have to add new controls in order to do? That's an accumulative process. Office 365 has around 900 controls in the control set right now. 2/3, 3/4 of those are active controls, okay? And then when an auditor comes, the process is to say, okay, these controls are equivalent to the controls in SOC 2. These controls are equivalent to the controls in FedRAMP. Here is our control evidence. Will you go through the control evidence, check that we're running the process, check the controls, and give us the certificate? So we do not have a whole 27001 set and then a full FedRAMP set and then a full SOC 2 set. It is a combined set of certificates. It's the only way we can manage this depth. And realistically, there are new threats, so there are new things you can do, but after a while, there's only so many ways you can secure a system, right? I mean, you're doing everything you know how to do, right? And so until a new threat comes and you go close the barn door after that particular horse, in case there are any more horses, you put a new control in place. You start to asymptotically approach what you can do. All right, so that's how we handle it today. But I will tell you that I think we as an industry, our customers are driving us this way, particularly our sophisticated customers. are moving to a post-certificate world, where they no longer, perhaps in the early stages of evaluating a service or deciding, well, is this something I even want to investigate as a potential in the solution design phase or something? They'll look at the certificate basis. But usually their risk management organization wants to see the actual control evidence. And we are moving more and more to the point where, and this is something called the, it's not the TSP now, what's it called? Service Trust Portal, where you will be able to get the evidence that we provided the auditor against the controls. So you can go look at the evidence directly. And that's one of the ways that our customers can talk to their regulators by doing evidence layering. They can say, okay, our responsibilities are this, our cloud service provider is this, here's the evidence they provide, here's our evidence, and provide that package and go get their own audits or certification. But we're moving out of a world where the certificate is enough into a world where there is a lot of evidence that the cloud service provider is going to give the customer. It's good news because it's transparent. It's bad news because there's a lot of stuff. And how did you know that you asked for all the right stuff, right? So one of the standards that the standards community has worked on in order to sort of respond to this issue of how do you organize all of the evidence that you need to think about is a cloud service level agreement framework, fondly known as 19086. And that was developed, it's been developed worldwide, came from two roots, one from NIST and another one from the European Commission. Sets of documents merged, pulled together. And when you really look at it, it's a due diligence checklist for the cloud. So when we're thinking about this hard, we said, how do we avoid asymmetry of information between the cloud service provider and the customer so you can make a fair deal, right? So somebody can actually make a deal and know what happened. What should they look at? And that standard, this is a checklist that is derived from that standard. That standard will be published November. Has elements in it of, for example, cloud service customer data, define cloud service customer data and usage terms. How do you use cloud customer data? Commercial services, the answer is almost always, well, for our services, we don't use it for anything but the provision and improvement of the service. And we're going to talk more about that. But we have a very limited scope of how we use customer data. But it also talks about account data, derived data, other classes of data, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But how is data use done? Data location. Where is the data stored? Where is it processed? Where did it go in transit? These are things that you should find out about when you go through the cloud service evaluation process. And what are the processes for law enforcement access? So this is about a quarter to a fifth of the elements on the checklist for 19086. And it's simply something that when you're writing an RFP or you're evaluating a cloud service, it's a due diligence checklist, right? Help you organize all of that evidence and figure out how to get it. Now, we're running around in the background, now that the standard's starting to close up, saying how do we organize the information we have on all our websites and give people a Rosetta Stone that is also organized by 19086 so we can respond quickly to these requests. But this is a way of communicating between these two. That's a transparency standard. So when we had a good question about, we had a couple of good questions about the data center in Germany and some of the work we're doing with the U.S. federal government. And I had some great questions about how the cloud works. And what you want to do, when it gets right down to it, the thing about the cloud is the cost curve is extraordinary. So it's 20% the cost to run 10,000 servers as it is 1,000 servers for the same unit of work. It's a fifth, and it keeps dropping. And oh, by the way, it's not just 1 over X. It's just not amortization of cost. It actually drops off more rapidly than that. 100,000 servers is a lot less expensive again. All right? So how do we want to provide those economies of scale to people, but still maintain data localization requirements, handling requirements, special handling for data? Well, the secret is to define data properly, right? We would like to be able to process and store locally, manage globally, right? So if we find a threat and we want to do an update to servers, we want to propagate update to servers worldwide without concern, right? So there's a whole level of management that we would like to be able to do without fettered access. You have to talk to people about that. I gave you the two really obvious things. Your data stored locally, you know exactly where it is. The temperature that comes off of the server racks that we monitor, you don't care, right? I should be able to pull that from Germany or Washington, D.C. or Beijing. Nobody cares. But in the middle is where the interesting conversation is about data, end-user identifiable information, organizationally identifiable information that we may want to work with around the world to improve our services. You may consider confidential. How do we talk about it? 19944 is a technology that's probably Q3 next year, end of summer next year, which is a taxonomy of data types for cloud data. And I'll show you a taxonomy picture. This button either gives me a laser or ends the world. It's a laser. It's okay, good. All right, it's just a big red dot. So this is literally the taxonomy of data. So, for example, customer content, for all of you who have been working on GDPR and thinking about it, here are 4 new entries that came in just recently into the standards development process: personal genetic data, biometric data, data of children, political opinions, financial details, starting to segment out the data that is specifically addressed as sensitive data in the GDPR so people can talk about it. Right? These are a taxonomy of data types so people can talk about data use. And that means we should be able to build an agreement, write a contract that says we treat all customer content this way, right? We only use it for this. However, your account data, which is specifically about your payment instrument data, we can work with worldwide. Can we agree to that? So we're not just saying where's the data, the data. We're talking about specific elements of data. And the standard also allows for the creation of very specific data use statements. And I'll click through this quickly. If anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, I'm happy to go in more detail. But it basically says, I'm going to qualify by how linked it is to an individual. I'm going to say a data type from somewhere is used by something to do something that results in something else. It's a structured statement that allows you to write a sentence like, aggregated telemetry data from this capability is used by this service to improve the CSP services, and every term in red is defined in the standard. So you can put that statement in a data use statement, and somebody can go and find out quite precisely what do you mean by that, okay? And so this is, there's 2 versions of it, a passive voice and an active voice, because it's an international standard. This allows you to write very, very precise data use statements in short form, but that boil down to actual commitments. And we're, as we get more complicated use of data, we think we're going to have to communicate more specifically with customers. We're very excited about this standard as a result. Another standard in the same mode that is in development, I'm going to answer a question you haven't asked, or you haven't asked me yet. What keeps me up at night? This is a standard for describing de-identification techniques by their characteristics and the kinds of attacks that they will withstand. It doesn't tell you how to do de-identification, right? It simply helps you describe de-identification. If any of you, and I presume many of you have been trying to explain to people what pseudonymization doesn't mean almost anonymization. Okay, it's not like, it's like pseudo-anonymization, right? It's kind of like anonymization, but not quite. And so those techniques, though, even in documents as serious as the GDPR, are bandied about without real understanding of what do you mean, of the injection of pseudonyms for direct identifiers is what I would call pseudonymization. It's not exactly the use in a lot of documents. So this standard says here is a taxonomy of de-identification techniques judged by their characteristics. And so when you describe to a regulator, you can say, I pursued this technique. My goals were to defeat these kinds of attacks. I used these kinds of inputs. Then I designed my process. Why is this? So one of the ones that's out here at the end is a framework, crystallizing framework, maybe I've got an old data, but is of differential privacy. What keeps me up at night? Somebody asked a good question about, is this a trend towards, is things like our German data center a trend towards Microsoft removing itself from the data so it doesn't have direct attached to the data? The answer is yes, that is a trend. Many of those techniques that keep us at arm's length for the data are extremely difficult to understand. Differential privacy, blockchain, heavy encryption, just-in-time processing. These are things that are critical to our trust with customers, very difficult for people writing policy to understand. And so this standard takes differential privacy and says, here's the goals, here's the limitations, here's how it might be used, and it helps define that. So again, it's a transparency standard. It's just a way to talk about these. And I would encourage you, when you're thinking about designing de-identification systems, try and get a draft of this standard or even join us and work on it as it goes forward so we can do a better job of describing very precisely what we mean by de-identification. By the way, the data qualifiers that were in the data use statement are linked closely with the de-identification standard. Those two standards are linked. So if you've described the data as unlinked or pseudonymized over here, you can go look in the other standard, exactly what do I mean to get that, so that ties the data use statements together. So in the end, that's what we're trying to accomplish in this aspect of transparency standards and certification standards in ISO. If you look at the classic relationships in a protection of PII, there is a controller, of course. The controller has some relationship with a cloud service provider. The controller at least is under the observation of a PII authority. I think with GDPR, and the processor has more direct obligations, maybe in directly talking to the DPA, but at least the controller is talking to a DPA. And these standards help in 19944, for example, help that controller describe, here is the data and here is how I am using it to that authority. We are very interested, again, in allowing governments to write their own laws, but when it comes down to sort of not their own facts, right? So when it comes down to the specific technical performance that you or we are supposed to do, have that defined by international standards. So that when they say pseudonymization, we all know what it means. When they say provide the service, we all know what it means. And what's really expensive for us if there is a different definition of provide the service in Germany than there is in France and there is in the UK, because we are then every time we make an enhancement to the system, we have to check all of those definitions. So the specific technical performance run by standards is our goal. So that's an important transaction. Same thing with the communication with the data subject, which is tougher. The standards, there is nobody posting photographs on Facebook that has read ISO 29100 to understand what their privacy rights nor will they read 19944. But if there was an iconography created as described in the GDPR, that iconography should be based on a fixed language of use. So you might be based on a standard down at the end. And then the critical one, of course, for us is the relationship between the cloud service provider and the PII controller. And then there are certification standards like 27018. You must or explain why not, codes of practice. And then there are descriptive standards like 19086. Tell me everything you did that's relevant to our relationship. Or 19944, tell me in detail everything you did with the data. We're going to write a contract on the basis of that. And that will be a much better contract for us over time. And then finally, the cloud service provider itself defines itself. All of the NIST terminology is now being put in international standards so we can use it. So the excellent presentation we had on how the cloud is structured, all that's based on international standards so we can go forward. Okay. So what would I love to have you do? Well, at least review 19944 when it comes out this November and provide feedback directly to anybody involved in ISO. You can provide it back to me or anybody else. But also think about using it. Actually, I used the wrong number there. It's the wrong number. 19086, the SLA standard is coming out in November. When that comes out, start using that to communicate with us and other vendors about your desires for information about the cloud. And then participate or at least review these new transparency standards to see how they're going to fit in the sort of quiver of tools we have for transparency going forward. Okay? So, with that, questions?
Thank you. Beata Craig from State Farm Insurance. I did not realize that there are so many techniques for de-identification. Are you able to provide a high-level description for me? What's the difference between de-identified data and anonymized data?
Sure. I'll tell you what the standard says. All right? So we picked de-identification as an umbrella term for all the techniques underneath. Anonymization is defined in the standard as you have now reduced, the data is no longer in the form of what you would call microdata. It is no longer a line item of data related to an individual. Even if you've removed the linkage between that individual and a real person, it's possible to re-identify them if you have enough individual line items. So anonymized data now aggregates the data together or adds enough noise to the data so that you can no longer detect a single individual in the data. It's a bad recitation of what's in the standard. All of the other techniques, pseudonymization techniques, which are also called de-identification techniques, take either direct or indirect identifiers. Gregg is a direct identifier, okay? Lives on Queen Anne in Seattle is an indirect identifier. You start removing those, that's levels of pseudonymization. I'm adding, usually you replace it with a number or something, a pseudonym. So that's a little bit of the difference, but you should have a look at the standard. It lays that all out.
When data is anonymized, you can't put it back together.
You cannot put it back together. And the thing is, you cannot put it back together to a guarantee. And that's another thing the standard talks about. So there are techniques in anonymization that say, you can kind of put it together, but you'll never know with more than, the least you can get to is 5 people with the same data. It's called k-anonymity, right? So there will be no fewer than 5 people that you can't tell amongst, right? So there are different kinds of attacks that people do, right? Do they want to find a senator out of the middle of a set of medical records? Or do they just want to find people who are likely to have a disease? And they don't care if they're not precisely right. They're going to send ads to them. That's a different kind of attack. So there are different kinds of attacks that you put on the data, different techniques, and the standard maps between those. So at least when you go talk to a regulator, say, this was the attack I was trying to prevent, and this is the technique I used, the regulator can say, okay, that's the attack we care about, and that technique is reasonable, and okay. Okay. So that's, I don't know if that's an answer, but we can talk about it. Okay. Yeah, we went through, and I skipped the data portability standard, but that was 300 pages of standards on the numbers I gave you so far. So.
Yeah, are these drafts all available, and where can we find them?
Yes and no.
The notorious online ISO store.
Well, yeah, the notorious ISO standard. They go through a dark period. So like 19086 right now, you can't see because it's about ready for publication. The other ones, yes, we can get drafts for people who are interested in reviewing or participating in the standardization. Yeah.
At work, we are always getting surveys, and they say this is completely anonymous when you reply to the survey, and they want to know your opinion on different things. And they're using things like SurveyMonkey sometimes, so it makes me not be completely assured that they're using anonymization like you're describing. Can you tell me what do they usually use?
They're usually using some form of what the standard would call secure pseudonymization. So they take your data, they replace it with an ID, and then they do what they call fuzz the ID. Right? So they take the number and add noise into the pseudonym, so it's quite hard to re-identify you. However, it's not resistant in the attack that said, well, give me everybody who had these 5 answers to the singling out attacks. It'd be easy to do with that data. And part of the problem we've had with de-identification in general is we've used terms like anonymous. Right? There's a famous Netflix prize example where they said this data is anonymous. And an academician applied one attack to it, singled out some data and said, no, it isn't. And therefore, nothing can be truly anonymous. Right? That's one attitude. The other attitude is HIPAA's approach to pseudonymization is quite basic. I mean, it takes the direct identifiers out, essentially. We really have not had a significant difficulty with re-identified medical data. Right? So it works. It really helps. It's much better than not doing anything. And that's one of the things that we really want to make sure is that companies do apply de-identification techniques as part of their improvement of their protection of PII, even though academically it's possible that it's not completely anonymous. So it's not a waste of time. And it's been a funny debate because people have not used the terms. What they mean is your data is pseudonymized and not anonymized. But, yeah. Sorry, it's been a long standard. Yeah.
More questions? Perhaps on that somewhat reassuring note, we can thank Gregg for his remarkable knowledge.
Yep. My pleasure.